And another interesting clinical correlation to this thyroid hormone conversation is if you think about someone who has hyperthyroidism. So you may have known someone or met someone or heard about it, but these patients usually exhibit all of the symptoms that are described here. This calorogenic effect. They're usually very nervous, anxious. They usually have a lot of weight loss, excess sweating, just all of the symptoms of just this increased metabolic activity, trouble sleeping, sometimes itchiness, sometimes muscle wasting because of constant muscle contraction. And so a lot of these symptoms can be explained by this calorogenic effect of thyroid hormone. All right, moving on to the parathyroid gland. And the parathyroid glands, rather, there are several of them, 4 of them to be specific, are embedded in the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland. So this is a posterior view of the thyroid gland, and this is where we have these 4 parathyroid glands embedded. Parathyroid hormone is important because it releases parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is then going to regulate calcium levels in the blood. So we spoke about calcitonin, and calcitonin is being released from the cells that are in between our follicles. That is going to decrease blood calcium levels, but our parathyroid hormone is going to be the antagonistic hormone of calcitonin. So parathyroid hormone is going to increase blood calcium levels, and it's going to do so by absorbing that from our bones. So it's going to take the calcium from our bones, mobilize that into the blood, and allow that to be circulated in the blood. All right, let's move on to objective 5, which is to describe the effects of glucocorticoids on whole body metabolism and to compare the physiologic effects of glucocorticoids to their pharmacological effects, okay? So the other gland that I mentioned we would get into was the adrenal gland, specifically the adrenal cortex, and another area. We'll talk about the medulla here in a minute. But the adrenal gland, we said, had 2 distinct regions. The cortex is what secretes some of these hormones that we're going to speak about now. These are called the adrenocorticoids, and this is where the anterior pituitary hormone, ACTH, so adrenocorticotropic hormone, this is where that hormone has its action on the adrenal cortex. It's going to stimulate the cortex to release mineralocorticoids, such as aldosterone. Aldosterone is important in regulating our sodium and potassium levels in the plasma, and it does so by acting in the kidneys. So if we need more sodium, aldosterone can help to regulate that, and we can reabsorb more sodium or potassium in the kidneys, etc. Glucocorticoids, example, cortisol, helps to regulate the body's stress response, and not just physiologic stress, but physical stress as well. And it also helps to regulate the metabolism, okay? It's gonna help to dampen the immune response and help the body to respond more appropriately to stress and to regulate the metabolism. And then the third hormone here is androgen. So one of the sex hormones. This is going to help regulate reproductive function. Although it's secreted in both males and females, it's at a higher quantity in males, and it plays more of an important role in male reproductive function. Okay. Now, within the medulla, we have these secretory cells. We described this earlier, so it's not really a part of the endocrine gland, so to speak. This is more involved in the sympathetic nervous system. This is where we have those chromaffin cells that secrete epinephrine, norepinephrine, and then a very small amount of dopamine. Okay, so this is under neural control. We also describe the connection where these chromaffin cells are more like postganglionic neurons than they are like an actual endocrine gland. So they are neurological in their origin. If we were to put these chromaffin cells in the right medium, they would grow axons. And so they are more neurological than they are epithelial, which is most of the makeup of, or which is the makeup of most of our endocrine glands, okay? Let's talk about the functions more in depth here. So glucocorticoids, main example being cortisol, is sort of generally known as our stress hormone. It helps us to regulate and modulate stress. It is secreted through the CRH, ACTH axis. So CRH coming from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and then the cortisol itself coming from the adrenal cortex. So a very similar axis to what we just drew out for the thyroid hormone. And so the feedback loops are going to look the exact same. So cortisol can have a long loop negative feedback onto the hypothalamus to stop CRH secretion, whereas ACTH can have a short loop negative feedback onto the hypothalamus, which can stop CRH secretion as well. Cortisol is going to help mobilize energy stores. It's going to help suppress the immune response. So this is what helps us to regulate stress. So let's say you just had surgery or you had an injury. You're going to need more energy for your cells to be involved in healing, but you're also going to want to sort of tone down that inflammatory response. If you just had surgery or if you just had an injury and there's not an actual threat in the body, so to speak, you don't want that, that immune response where there are cells looking for an invader or anything like that. And so that is where cortisol comes into play. And this is why we usually give patients cortisol or steroids to help them tone down or dampen that immune response. And yeah, that's kind of its role as well. Here are some of the general adaptations to stereotypical response to stress. So essentially, it's going to help increase cortisol secretion. We're going to see increased sympathetic activity. We're going to see increased epinephrine secretion, which is synonymous with that increased sympathetic activity. We're going to see increase in ADH release. ADH release is going to help us reserve more fluid. We said ADH coming from the posterior pituitary is antidiuretic hormone. So it's going to help us hold on to more fluid, which is something that we want in periods of stress. We're also going to see angiotensin II production, also having a similar role in terms of fluid conservation. And then we're going to see that fight or flight mechanism in general. So this goes for not only physiologic stress that I just described, where we have surgery, some type of injury, but it also goes for mental stress as well. And if you're stressed about something mentally, emotionally, you need to understand that you're eliciting this response, which is very unhealthy in your body, okay? So again, your body does not understand the difference between a surgery, the difference between a physiologic threat, and the difference between some type of mental or emotional stress. So it's really important to understand that when we are chronically stressed, our body is always eliciting this fight or flight response, which is not actually very healthy. We're going to be mobilizing energy stores. This can lead to overeating, right? This can lead to just general unhealthy coping mechanisms that should only be elicited during times of physiologic or threatening situations. All right, number 6 here, so our 6th objective we're going to introduce here briefly. This is to describe the hormonal control of metabolism during the absorptive and post-absorptive states, okay? So when we speak about energy metabolism, it's really important to think about the 2 main states of that metabolism and how we can regulate that. So there is the absorptive state, and then there is the post-absorptive state. So the absorptive state, I like to call the fed state. This is after you've had a large meal, if you are adequately fed, if you are nourished, and we can kind of think back to caveman days. Cavemen theoretically would go for days without food. And so when they did get a large meal, they would be in this absorptive or fed state. This is where we have energy that's being stored up for a time where we're going to need it later on. And this is a sort of that healthy storing up anabolic state. We can contrast that to the post-absorptive state. This is the fasting state. Again, looking at that caveman scenario or example, if we've gone for days without food, we're in that post-absorptive state. We are not storing up energy. In fact, we are looking in every crevice of our body, looking at all of our tissues possible, trying to exhaust all of our possible storage forms of energy to liberate that energy to keep us going, to keep cellular functions going, and to keep us physically alive, okay? So these are the 2 main energy metabolism states. We've got the absorptive state, which is when we're well fed, and we've got the post-absorptive state, which is where we have not been fed for a while. And I like to call this the fasting state. Okay, looking at the energy input versus output during these states, during the absorptive state, our energy inputs outweigh or exceed our energy outputs. So nutrients are being absorbed here. So that means we're getting more nutrient input than what we're actually acquiring or using. So glucose is going to be the primary energy source for most of our cells. And so excess nutrients that we are intaking will be stored up in their relative forms. So they'll be stored up in the liver, in the muscle as glycogen. They'll be stored up in our adipose tissue or our fat tissue as triglycerides, okay? So here is a flow chart that explains what that looks like. So we're eating lots of food here. We're in a well-fed state. We're getting in all these nutrients, fatty acids, glucose, amino acids from our proteins, from our fats, from our carbohydrates that we're ingesting. And we're going to take those micronutrients that we've broken down and we're going to start storing them up, right? We're going to take what we need first, and then we'll start storing up the rest for another time when we don't have access to food and to nutrients. So the first thing we do is in most of our body cells, we use that to drive glycolysis. So with carbon dioxide, water, and energy being released, most of our body cells will take that glucose and drive glycolysis for our immediate energy demands. The rest of that we'll store up. So we'll store some of that glucose up as glycogen in our liver and muscle. We'll store some of those fatty acids up along with glycogen. So glycogen and fatty acids can be stored in liver and in our fat tissue. So we can combine fatty acids with glycerol, the glycerol coming from those glycogens, from those glucose stores, the fatty acids coming from our fats, and we can combine those to make triglycerides, which is stored away in our fat tissue for a later time. This is why you put on weight if you're overeating chronically, right? You're storing away reserves for a later time. Amino acids, which are the breakdown products of proteins, are also used to help store up future reserves. So we can take some of those amino acids, convert them to fatty acids, and then help to make triglycerides. We can also take those amino acids and directly make proteins as well. So store up muscle, build up muscle rather, and then have those tucked away for later use. Now, a small little disclaimer here, proteins are not generally broken down. And so when we say build up muscle, build up proteins for a later time, we don't usually want to tap into our proteins. We don't usually want to break down proteins. That is actually the last resort when we are looking for energy. Okay, so we're just building up proteins, and if we need to, we can tap into them, but that's going to be one of our last resorts to break down muscle. Now, if we think about the post-absorptive state, this is where energy output is outweighing energy input. Again, this is synonymous with the fasting state. Glucose is spared for the nervous system. So our tissues in general are going to use fatty acids. They're going to use anything they can get their hands on, really. We can break down proteins again as a last resort, but the brain is kind of so spoiled and obnoxious in this way, it really only likes glucose, okay? So it's going to use as much of the glucose as it can. Other cells are going to actually sacrifice their glucose and send it to the brain if there are times when glucose is at a real all-time low, all right? So those storage nutrients that we just explained how we stored are going to now be broken down and mobilized. We can mobilize those sources to liberate the energy to maintain us during this post-absorptive state. All right, another flow chart, a little bit more complex, that shows what that process looks like. So we've gone maybe 5-6 days without a meal, and I'm kind of exaggerating here, but you get the idea. We're in a fasted state where we have gone for a long period without introducing nutrients or food. So we're going to start tapping into our reserves. And again, while protein is the first one that's shown here, this is really the last resort, right? We don't usually tap into our muscles. We don't break down our muscles first when we're trying to find these storage forms of energy. But we can, right? We can if we need to. So proteins can be broken down to amino acids. Those amino acids can help to liberate energy for non-nervous tissue. Again, the brain is not going to be able to use the breakdown products of proteins to liberate energy. Adipose tissue, we can certainly tap into our fat. So this is one of the best sources of sustaining us during periods of fasting. We can tap into those fat cells. We can break down those triglycerides. We can liberate fatty acids, which can do one thing, glycerol, which can do another thing. Fatty acids can help us drive energy production in non-nervous tissue as well, so not in the brain. But then fatty acids can also be converted to ketones. And this is using the process of beta oxidation. We talked about this process in chapter 3. So there's a pathway here where we can take some of those fatty acids, we can shuttle them off to the liver, and we can generate energy by converting these to ketones. Those ketones can be used in nervous tissue as well as non-nervous tissue. So while the brain really prefers glucose, it'll take ketones. It'll use ketones if ketones are in the blood, and it will take that as a second option if there's absolutely no glucose stores around. Okay. And then the other two pathways here, the liver can break down that glycogen to make glucose. Muscle as well. Muscle also has glycogen being stored up. We can turn that into glucose, and that glucose is really what the brain prefers. But as you would imagine, non-nervous tissue can use that as well. So we're going to use that glucose to produce energy for nervous tissue, and that can help sustain us until we can have another meal. And so this is why some diets tout the fasted state, because as you can see, it really helps us to tap into some of these stores, especially those triglyceride and adipose tissue stores, and liberate some of that, those storage forms to generate the energy to kind of thrive, to help our body thrive or survive during periods where we're not receiving food. This is also where the ketogenic diets come into play. So if we're not getting glucose, we do have routes that we can use fats to make most of our energy. So if we're not having diets that have carbohydrates, bread and rice and pasta, we actually more heavily depend on our fat storage. We tap into those fats more readily, we shuttle that off into ketones, and the brain can use that so we can still maintain good brain supply of energy, and then other tissues can use those ketones as well, and the fats, okay? All right, let's talk about kind of putting this all together and how this is regulated with hormone release. So we've got two major hormones that are playing a role here. There is insulin. Insulin is the hormone of the absorptive state, of the fed state. So when we have a large meal, insulin is released in large quantities, and that is to facilitate us storing up these energy sources that we just described. Glucagon, on the other hand, is going to be the antagonistic hormone to insulin. Glucagon is going to be secreted in the post-absorptive state. And glucagon is going to do the opposite. It's going to help us tap into those reserves, tap into those storage areas in muscle, in the liver, in our fat cells, and release or liberate those energy forms in order to generate ATP. Okay. Other less important regulators are going to be epinephrine, which is playing a role in terms of the sympathetic nervous system. And so that will also help to regulate or modulate how we can shuttle between insulin and glucagon, and how we can shuttle between the absorptive and post-absorptive states. Okay, let's talk about the role of insulin here. So insulin is a peptide hormone that's secreted from the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas. And so its action is to help us build up energy stores. It's going to help us get that glucose from the bloodstream into our cells so it can be stored up. It's also going to help us synthesize triglycerides, synthesize glycogen, and it's going to promote glucose use for energy storage for a later time. So increasing that glucose uptake so that it can be catabolized and put away, or so it can be anabolized, right? Put away or stored up for a later time. But it's also going to decrease glucose catabolism, so decrease the breakdown of those macronutrients, okay? Insulin is actually secreted from the beta cells of the islets of Langerhans of the pancreas. So we talked about the pancreas having this dual compartment. It's got some exocrine parts. It's got some endocrine parts. The endocrine parts are called the islets of Langerhans. And within the islets of Langerhans, which is this entire cluster here of cells, we have the green part is the cluster of cells, that is. We have the alpha, beta, and delta cells. The beta cells secrete insulin, so these are the ones that are more centrally located in green, whereas the alpha and delta cells are usually more peripherally located, and the alpha cells specifically secrete glucagon. Okay. All right, now insulin, we said, increases during the absorptive state. So if you just had a really large meal, you're going to secrete lots of insulin. That's going to help you absorb those nutrients, those micronutrients, and store them away for later use. It's going to increase glucose in the plasma. It's going to be secreted in response, it's going to be secreted in response to increased glucose in the plasma, increased amino acids in the plasma, the parasympathetic nervous system, so the rest and digest branch. So again, if you're having a large meal, that parasympathetic system is going, that's going to be a signal for insulin to be released. And then another hormone here called glucose-dependent insulinotropic peptide, or GIP, is another trigger for us to release insulin, and that is secreted in response to stretch in the stomach and lots of food coming in, okay? And so all of these things will help us to release more insulin, to store these things away for later use. The secretion is going to decrease in the post-absorptive state. So during the post-absorptive state, which is kind of that fight or flight or freeze state, where we have the sympathetic nervous system going, we're going to see a decrease in insulin secretion, because if we are running from a threat, fighting or fleeing or freezing, we're not trying to store away energy for later. We're trying to tap into those energy stores, which is the exact opposite. That is going to be a function of the post-absorptive state. Okay. All right. Here is what those beta cells look like. So they secrete insulin. Here are some of the things that insulin does. In most of our tissues, it's going to help glucose uptake, except in the brain, the liver, and exercising muscle. It's going to help with amino acid uptake. It's going to help with protein synthesis. It's going to help decrease protein breakdown. So again, decreasing that catabolism of our nutrients. In terms of adipose tissue, it's going to increase fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis. So again, storing those up for later use, but also decrease lipolysis. So decrease the catabolism or the breakdown of fats. In liver and muscle, it's going to help with increased glycogen synthesis. So again, storing up glycogen for later use, but then on the opposite end, it's going to stop or decrease glycogenolysis, which is the breakdown of glycogen. And lastly, it's going to help increase fatty acid and triglyceride synthesis, storing up that fat tissue, those fat cells for later use, but then stop gluconeogenesis, which is the breakdown of those fatty acids and triglycerides. We're going to stop or inhibit that catabolism there.